We know that despotic forms of government dismiss the significance and value of individual human lives. Today, we'll explore some implications of a government's dismissal of the right to life. Brian Johnston is the Western Director of the National Right to Life Committee. He has served in many capacities while advocating for innocent lives. And now here's our host, Brian Johnston.
Well, welcome back to Life Matters, your program on life, culture, and the very real battle of ideas. And if you don't realize that you are in a battle of ideas right now, a battle for your thoughts and for the thoughts and opinions and decisions of your friends and neighbors, if you don't realize this battle is raging all around you, then you've already lost. That's right. Ideas have consequences. And ideas in this battle are the tools. Ideas need to be understood. Laws eventually are made, and you know what laws really are? They're ideas that are simply enforced. So we're going to talk about the right to life today and about its direct connection to the issue of slavery. In fact, how the right to life and the issue of slavery are so intertwined, they are in fact the same issue. So today we're going to talk about the history of slavery in the United States and its relationship to the abortion issue. It's a direct relationship. It's not simply the Supreme Court decisions, perhaps you've heard about that the Dred Scott Decision of the U.S. Supreme Court was a sweeping decision that basically not simply allowed, but enshrined and protected slavery in the United States, even in free states. That's right. Perhaps you didn't realize that that's what Dred Scott's decision was about. The Supreme Court ruled and stated that slaves are property, and you could transport that property into a free state. Even though it was illegal, you still owned that slave. And slavery, therefore, was legal throughout the nation by virtue of that. Even though there were states that prohibited it, the Supreme Court said, no, slavery gets to be practiced in the United States of America, and you can't stop it even when you pass laws against it in your state. Pretty stunning decision. And of course, the Dred Scott decision is always and should be compared to the Roe v. Wade decision, which in many ways says the same thing. Even if your state had laws against abortion, and all states did in 1973. All states, even California, New York, Colorado, and Massachusetts, which had liberalized laws, they still said in the law that that was a baby at some point, usually about 20 to 25 weeks. They said after that, you can't kill that kid, sorry. But before that, just come up with some reason, and they had a list of reasons. But they had laws that recognized that's an unborn child. Roe versus Wade refused to recognize that child as having any rights. Read Roe versus Wade. It denies the right to life of the child. That's why it's considered property of the mother. She can do what she wants with it, just like a slave owner could with a slave. So these decisions are really very, very parallel in their implications and the fact that they impacted the whole nation. But there's even more, and we're going to talk about that today on Life Matters. We're going to talk about some of the names you know already from the slavery issue. Abraham Lincoln is one. I want you to understand the things that are going much deeper than the very facile ideas that he freed the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation. That actually was not what ended slavery. And we've gone into that in the past. If you don't believe me, you go ahead and look it up. I want to encourage you to look up what the Emancipation Proclamation was. It was actually an act to seize the property of a warring nation. It was a legal act under the War Powers Act, but it did not end slavery. In fact, it cemented slavery in certain states. It actually allowed those states, there were 3 at the time, that practiced slavery, but were not part of the rebellion against the United States. And so Lincoln's decision only applied to those states that had broken with the Union and gone to war with the Union. It did not free slaves. It was the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, and the 14th as well. It had to be done through the legislative process. So that's a minor footnote, but there's a lot more about slavery you haven't fully been told The real culprit, in many ways, weren't so much the slave states. The real problem in America are the people who said, well, we don't like slavery, but, it's just part of our culture now, and we have to accept it and tolerate it. And in fact, that very famous opponent of Abraham Lincoln, Justice Stephen Douglas, famously would proclaim that he was against slavery personally. But when it came to the legal issue, he favored choice. He was pro-choice on slavery, and he actually used that term. He was from Illinois, a northern state, and he was a Democrat, and it was actually the Northern Democrats who were helping preserve slavery. So as we look at the issue, you have to look at the issue not from the perspective of the 21st century and your sensibilities. In the 1800s, it was actually many Northerners who didn't want to make it a big issue because it would just cause problems, and they helped to preserve slavery. Stephen Douglas was the leader of that, and he introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which did away from the important compromises of American history, the Missouri Compromise, most tangibly, but the Compromise of 1850, the Compromise of 1830. These were important compromises that limited slavery. He did not want to limit slavery. He was a Democrat. He said he was against slavery, but he was pro-choice. And he said, I want states to choose. I want Kansas and Nebraska, when they become states, to choose whether or not they'll let slavery happen. He said that the very year that Dred Scott's Supreme Court decision came down, which cemented slavery as an American institution. So he called himself personally opposed, but he was aiding and abetting and supporting choice in slavery. And that was Stephen Douglas. We'll talk about him a little bit more after this, but the really important individual you've heard nothing about in American history, and yet is the direct father of the pro-life movement and a direct connection between the slavery issue and the abortion issue, is a physician from Massachusetts, Boston, Massachusetts, by the name of Dr. Horatio Storer. Among other things, he's the founder of modern gynecology. Go ahead and look him up. We're going to spend a lot of time today explaining how the abortion issue and the slavery issue are directly related and are, in fact, the same issue, and how Horatio Storer brought that together. And he nearly single-handedly, but he was really part of a much larger movement of physicians, noble physicians who obeyed and followed the Hippocratic Oath. He was part of a movement to make sure that human lives were protected under the law, because that's what the end of slavery brought about, the protection of innocent human lives. And these physicians knew that innocent babies were being killed. Dr. Storer, as I said, was the father of modern gynecology and the understanding of childbirth. He studied abroad on that. We'll talk about that. But he said quite clearly, that child is my second patient. And he worked to ensure that child's life was protected. And it was those laws that were overturned almost 100 years later in the Roe v. Wade decision. You need to know why those laws were there and why the pro-life movement didn't just start in 1973, but it goes back to 1873 and before, because it was the end of slavery that brought about the desire to end legalized abortion. We'll talk about that more when we come back.
Life Matters continues after this.
They say sunlight is the best disinfectant. Did you know that California has a law in the books that says you need to protect babies born alive in the course of an abortion? But that law is simply ignored. The current legislature and Governor Newsom's administration support all abortions all the time. And they simply do not examine or regulate the practice, even though our tax dollars pay for it. We need to shine a light on this cover-up of the abortion industry in our state. Go to CaliforniaProLife.org and click on the Light of Day project. We need the facts about late-term abortion to be examined and made known. We need the government doing its job to protect lives. We need the light of day on this. Go to CaliforniaProLife.org.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Hey, well, welcome back. Remember what we're doing today? We're talking about the direct relationship between slavery and abortion. It's very easy now to look back on America during slaveholder times and dismiss those people as simple as it's unbelievable, really, that people would hold slaves. But you're looking at it from contemporary perspective. I believe that soon, it won't be easy, but soon we're going to be doing that when it comes to human abortion. That people will look back at this time in American history and say, my God, they actually declared that human babies were mere possessions that were not even worthy of any consideration under the law. Human babies have no protection whatsoever under Roe. And even once they're born, you could set the child aside because your goal was to kill the kid. And if the kid happens to be born alive in that process, doctors would just set the kid aside to die. That's what Roe v. Wade has brought to our culture. And when people in the future look back, they're going to say, how could that have happened? Just as we say that now about slavery. So I want to bring you back to slaveholding times. Remember, I want you to understand why it was a challenge, why Abraham Lincoln got so much pushback, because he lived in a culture that had adopted this tolerance of slavery. How could that be? Well, let me give you some explanation. Again, Stephen Douglas, if you read Lincoln's life and his political opponents, he saw Stephen Douglas as one of the leaders of great evil. He was a Northerner. I want to remind you that Northerners were contributing to the support of slavery. Northerners caused many problems that allowed slavery to continue because they didn't want to confront it as an evil. And you can look and read the debates that Lincoln had with Stephen Douglas. I would recommend in particular the debate at Alton, Illinois. Now, I know people don't read as much as they used to, so you can look at some great movies about this, but I would recommend that you read. And the reason I say that is those debates were meant to be read. At the time, those debates impacted the nation because that was the technology of the time, reading newspapers in every town and village and hamlet in the nation of the United States had a printing press, a newspaper, a local newspaper. And anyone who could read would read. It was more impactful than the internet. That was the technology of the time. And every town had a newspaper that was either pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And because of that, they all reprinted these debates, which were debates over slavery. The newly founded Republican Party was making inroads, and here was this country bumpkin Lincoln, a country lawyer that people laughed at, and Stephen Douglas was considered the best debater in the world at that time. And so they considered this a slam dunk, and yet it was designed to be read. So everyone in the nation that could read would read, and everyone in the nation read those debates. Those debates impacted the world. And I'd like you to read them. One of the things that came up in Alton, Illinois, among other things, among several, I can't go into the whole debate, but it's a wonderful debate. And it looks like initially when you read Stephen Douglas's argument, they're very compelling. He actually makes some very compelling arguments. One of them is this, is that, Mr. Lincoln, you're causing trouble. You're going to divide this nation and cause a civil war, even though it was Douglas who introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which brought about the first shots of the Civil War, you might say. Bleeding Kansas. You know the story of the Jayhawkers. This precedes the Civil War, but there was bloodletting because of what Douglas had done through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But he was blaming Lincoln. And he said this, and it was cogent. He said, Mr. Lincoln, you declare that slavery is unconstitutional, and yet half of the signers of that very document owned slaves. How dare you? How dare you assert this? You are causing great division because the signers of the Constitution owned slaves. And I have to hand it to Lincoln. He was very deft in his response, and I'll have to summarize it. He basically said this: no, Mr. Douglas, you haven't read the Constitution, or most importantly, its foundation, the Declaration of Independence. Because the framers of the Constitution knew that they could not grant the right to life. And it's interesting that he used that term, the right to life, when he was referring to slavery. And the reason he did that is there were many people in the culture, not just Stephen Douglas. Many people kind of viewed slavery as a form of employment like indentured servitude, but maybe kinder. In other words, they actually implied, if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, well, these were the poor darkies who couldn't take care of themselves. Whereas indentured servitude, you had 7 years of obligation, and sometimes more. These would repeat, and you had to pay off your service with your work, and your employer got free work out of you. So they viewed slavery as kind of a weird form of indentured servitude culturally. I'm not saying that's what it was, but Lincoln went to the heart of it, because while they implied, well, it's a kindness. We're taking care of these people who couldn't take care of themselves otherwise. We're actually helping them out and providing room and board and lodging and, of course, all sorts of nice frills. Yeah, right. And Lincoln cut through that by saying, well, if that's the case, how come you can kill them? Because if you own a slave, it isn't just that they had to work for you. You owned them. You could kill them. And so Lincoln himself brought up the right to life. But Lincoln went further and more explicitly. He said that our founders knew they could not grant the right to life. That, in fact, the job of government is not to grant it, because that can only be granted by our Creator. But it's the duty of government to ensure that right. And they sought to do so as soon as it were practicable. That is to say, they couldn't, since half of the states already had slavery, they couldn't have created a union that banned slavery, but it could recognize its evils, which it did. And many people that have studied the Constitution know that the 3/4 of a person aspect in the issue of population and representation, that was intentionally put in as a creative way of both giving the South and the notion that, we're going to get more votes. But it also tacitly implies, there is something about that slave, that's a person that in some way should get some kind of representation. So it was literally a legal foot in the door of recognition. But they couldn't end slavery at the founding. And it's ironic that Jefferson, of all people, is being invoked all the time, and he ended up, unlike many of the slaveholders, he could have but didn't release his slaves upon his death. Most of the other founders that were slaveholders, like Washington and others, they released their slaves upon their death. They knew it was a dying institution, that it wasn't merely a form of indentured servitude. But come back with me now to the 1850s, when that's what a lot of Democrats thought. Because it was the Democrat Party that was pro-choice on slavery, even in the North. It was the Democrats that said, we don't like it, but, there's a lot of strange things we put up with, and we don't want to get into a war. So the Democrat Party was pro-choice, and the Democrat Party was also really big on alternatives to slavery. So I want you to think about that for a moment. There were many people who said, let's do something about it, but let's don't end it. And you may not know this, but the creation of our one colony in Africa, Liberia, was actually supposed to be an answer to slavery, but it was a way of saying we won't confront slavery. We'll simply deal with the issue in this indirect way, and we'll send off freed slaves to live in Liberia. It'll be great. And that became a bit of a fiasco, and I know Liberian citizens that are now American citizens, and there is a connection to America there in Liberia, but Liberia was a real bizarre alternative to slavery, and we're not looking for alternatives to abortion ultimately. The goal of the Right to Life movement is to restore the right to life, just as Lincoln was out to restore the right to life. And he explicitly said that in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And every American read that. Every American that could read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And that helped diffuse the cultural confusion of the time. There's cultural confusion going on right now. But you have to understand the issues and help others to understand the issues about the human being in the womb, as well as what the right to life really is. So when we come back, we're going to go to, I think, the most important hero of the pro-life movement, who literally understood and fought for not just the end of slavery, but the end to the idea that a baby in the womb is a possession that could be discarded and killed. And that is Dr. Horatio Storer. Stand by, you're going to like his story.
Life Matters continues after this.
You know about our car donation program at California Pro-Life. We use one of the most respected programs in the nation. Go to the California Pro-Life page, californiaprolife.org. Scroll to the bottom and click on Donate My Car. It's that easy. Did you know you can also donate any vehicle, boat, motorhome, or even personal property? If you are nearing retirement age, you can also get a tax deduction by earmarking a portion of your upcoming compulsory distributions from your 401k. Just email us for information. California Pro-Life is fighting to equip California pro-lifers with understanding and the tools to again protect the unborn and other vulnerable innocents. Thank you for your help in this battle. Go to californiaprolife.org. That's californiaprolife.org for more information.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Welcome back. I told you you're going to like this story about Dr. Horatio Storer. You probably never heard of him, but you need to know about him. He was a Boston physician. He studied in Boston. He graduated and went into practice in 1857, but then decided to get further studies in childbirth. And at that time, the leading medical institution was in Scotland. No, not in England, not in Oxford, and not in Cambridge, but in Edinburgh. If you wanted to learn medicine, you went to Edinburgh. Coincidentally, you may realize that Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, based that on his medical professor at Edinburgh. And Conan Doyle was a doctor who studied there. It was the preeminent medical school of the time. But there's something even more, that when Horatio Storer came over, remember, in 1857, that was the year of the Dred Scott Decision in America. But he went back to the UK. And you already know this, that the Brits were ahead of us in ensuring freedom for slaves and condemning slavery as an evil and making sure that the laws, again, we're in a battle of ideas, and ideas have consequences. And laws are basically ideas that are enforced. Laws are critical. And in England and all of the UK and across the seas, because at that time the Brits ruled the waves, they ended the slave trade, and they would hunt down slave ships. It was awesome. So he went to a country that had ended slavery. They'd ended slavery through the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. So they were at least 30 years ahead of us, but those sensibilities were catching on. They were aware of those sensibilities in America, and as you know, even at America's founding, many of those founders were in fact strong abolitionists. Go ahead and look it up. America was against slavery at its founding, ardently so. Franklin was a leader in his anti-slavery society in Philadelphia. So the anti-slavery movement was with us from the founding. They made sure that there was recognition and a method to ending slavery when they started the Constitution. And the Brits, of which we were extracted, we borrowed British common law. All of our founders were emulating the British view of government and limited government that they had inherited, and in fact were appealing to the king based on both common law and on English law. You may not realize that the English came up with a Bill of Rights before the Americans ever did. That by a couple hundred years, a Bill of Rights was passed in England. So the English were well ahead of us, and they were well ahead of us on the issue of slavery. And you know what? This is what Horatio Storer also saw, that on the issue of abortion, the Brits were ahead of us. You see, at that time, abortion was being practiced. A lot of it in ignorance, and a lot of it was convenience. People didn't understand. And people say now, just as Justice Blackmun said in his decision, we don't know when life begins. Well, that's a lie. Any honest person, an honest third grader will tell you that today. We know, and they found out in 1836, remember, the Brits were at the head of the Industrial Revolution, and they were great with using technology and for science. And we have known since 1836, with the invention of the modern microscope, through viewing mammalian conception, that life begins at conception and just grows. That's a life. If it's a rabbit, if it's a dog, if it's a cat, if it's a human being, begins at conception and continues to grow. Well, back in England at that time, There was a bill passed in 1860 called the Crimes Against the Person Act, and the Brits banned abortion in 1860 because they knew that this was a human life, and medical science recognized it was a human life. And Dr. Horatio Storer was there to study not specifically just medical science, but actually the life of the child and the care of the child and childbirth. And as I said, he's the founder of American and worldwide gynecology. The man was extraordinary. They don't want to talk about him in the feminist movement because he came back to the States and said, we have ended slavery. We have brought about legal protection for that human being that was once called a slave. We must now bring legal protection for that child in the womb, what he called my second patient. That's Dr. Horatio Storer. And almost single-handedly, he became the leader. He wrote extensively on this. He organized the American Medical Association to go state by state to make sure that the states, because remember, under our Constitution, anything that is not handled in the Constitution is handled by the states. So homicide laws, there's various types of homicides, and in various states, the abortion provision was found under a homicide law. So you can have first degree, second degree, you can have various forms of manslaughter. And then in other states, it would be found under the health and safety provisions or under the provisions that specifically regulated the practice of medicine. But in every state in the nation, the American Medical Association was part of this. They passed what was known as the Physicians' Crusade Against Abortion. So every state had laws that recognized that's a human baby. And we need to protect that most vulnerable of human beings through the law. Those laws stayed in place and were in place in 1973. Again, even in liberal states, those liberal states still recognize, you might have some abortions, the standard litany. What about rape, incest, life of the mother, severe fetal deformity? That standard litany would be tossed out. But even after that, for example, in California, after 20 weeks, you can't kill that kid. Before 20 weeks, come up with one of those reasons, okay? But after 20 weeks, the law is going to protect that child. Roe versus Wade struck down the laws of every state. Those laws were put into place by the heroic work of an anti-slavery and anti-abortion doctor, Dr. Horatio Storer, the actual founder of the Right to Life movement, and he did it based on the American principles of the right to life as being a God-given gift, and then it's the duty of government to protect that right to be alive. Thanks for listening.
Life Matters is a production of the California Pro-Life Council, the state affiliate of National Right to Life.